Well, come to shadow liturgy. Some men become legends, not because of what they did, but because of what others believed they could do. In the cotton fields of Georgia, there lived a man who moved through locked doors as if they were made of air. He walked past armed guards as if invisible. He entered the most secure homes in the county, and not a single plantation owner dared to stop him. This wasn't magic. This wasn't folklore. This was something far more disturbing. A power born from fear itself, from secrets too dark to speak aloud, and from a truth that would destroy everyone who tried to reveal it. His name was Thomas, and by the time you understand why no one stopped him, you'll realize that some prisons have no bars, and some chains can't be broken, even by freedom itself. The first time anyone noticed Thomas's unusual freedom was on a humid August night in 1857, when Mrs. Elizabeth Hartley woke to the sound of her bedroom door closing. Not opening, closing. She lay in the darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs, trying to convince herself she'd imagined it. The house settled and creaked in the summer heat. Old wood did that. There was nothing unusual about a door moving slightly in the night, except she knew, with the certainty that comes from true terror, that someone was in her room. Her husband, plantation owner Richard Hartley, was away on business in Savannah, a trip that had been planned for weeks. The house was locked, every door bolted before the household retired. 3 overseers patrolled the grounds with rifles and dogs trained since puppyhood to tear apart any slave found outside the quarters after dark. The animals had cost Richard $200 each, imported from a breeder in Virginia who specialized in what he called plantation security. Elizabeth's eyes had adjusted to the darkness now. The curtains were drawn, but thin moonlight seeped through the edges, casting the room in shades of black and grey. And there at the foot of her bed stood a shadow in the shape of a man, perfectly still, perfectly silent, just standing there watching her. Elizabeth screamed, caught in her throat, trapped behind terror. Her hand moved slowly toward the bell pool beside her bed, the one that would summon the household, bring men with guns running. Her fingers were inches from the silk cord when the shadow spoke. "No need for that, Mom." The voice was quiet, respectful, even a man's voice, deep and measured, and somehow that made it worse. The politeness, the lack of threat in the tone, as if standing in a white woman's bedroom in the middle of the night was the most natural thing in the world. "Who?" Elizabeth's voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Who are you? What do you want?" "My name is Thomas, Mom. I work your husband's fields. I've come to deliver something." The shadow moved, and Elizabeth flinched, but he was only reaching into his coat, a coat she noticed now with growing confusion that looked far too fine for a field hand. He withdrew something small and placed it carefully on her dresser. "Mr. Hartley left this in town," Thomas said. "At the Parker Hotel in a room he rented under a different name. Thought you might want to see it before he returns from Savannah." Elizabeth stared at the dark shape on her dresser, a book of some kind or a journal. "How did you—" She started, but Thomas was already moving toward the door. "Wait, how did you get in here? The doors are locked, the windows were latched." "Yes, ma'am." "I know. Then how?" "Sometimes doors open for people who know where the keys are kept." His hand was on the doorknob now, "and sometimes people who should keep doors locked forget that their servants know more than they let on." He opened the door. The hinges made no sound. Someone had oiled them recently. Thomas stepped into the hallway, then paused and looked back. "I'd read that journal before Mr. Hartley comes home, ma'am. All of it. Every page. You'll want to know what kind of man you're married to." Then he was gone. Elizabeth heard his footsteps descending the main staircase, not the servants' stairs in the back, but the grand staircase reserved for family and guests, heard the front door open with a soft click, heard it close again. She sat frozen in bed for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, moving like a woman in a dream, she rose and walked to the dresser. The journal was leather-bound, expensive. She'd carry it to the window, pulled back the curtain to let in more moonlight, and opened to the first page. Richard's handwriting. She'd recognize it anywhere. The careful, precise script he used for important business documents. The first entry was dated March 1845. 12 years ago, Met with JH and FB today regarding the Georgia coastal venture. Initial investment required $15,000 per partner. Expected return 400% within 3 years. The risk is considerable, but the alternative is bankruptcy. We agreed to move forward. God forgive us for what we're about to do. Elizabeth turned the page. More entries, each one more detailed than the last. Descriptions of investments, of partnerships, of ventures that Richard had never mentioned to her. Names she recognized: Joshua Harper, Franklin Bradford, William Patterson, Judge Marcus Kent, the most powerful men in the county, all involved in something called the Georgia Coastal Venture. She kept reading. The entries became more explicit. References to cargo and shipments, mentions of a Captain Williams who operated a vessel called the Nightingale, detailed accounts of payments made to customs officials, to harbor masters, to sheriffs in 3 different counties. And then on a page dated July 1845, the truth became horrifyingly clear. The Nightingale arrived last night at the inlet north of Brunswick. Captain Williams reports 247 souls aboard, 31 lost during the crossing. The survivors are in poor condition but should recover enough to be presentable within a fortnight. Harper has already arranged buyers in Charleston and New Orleans. We should clear $80,000 after expenses. The venture proceeds as planned. Elizabeth's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the journal. She read the entry again, hoping she'd misunderstood, but there was no misunderstanding possible. Her husband, her respectable church-going community pillar husband, had been involved in smuggling slaves directly from Africa, not buying slaves through legal markets, but smuggling them, importing human beings in violation of federal law, in violation of international treaties, in violation of everything their society claimed to stand for, however hypocritically. The act had been illegal since 1808. The punishment was death by hanging. She turned page after page, reading through the night. The operation had continued for 3 years, from 1845 to 1848. Multiple ships, thousands of people smuggled and sold, millions of dollars in profit divided among the conspirators. The journal included everything: names of ship captains, dates of arrivals, numbers of people transported and sold, officials who'd been bribed and how much they'd received, false documentation that had been created, slave markets where the smuggled people had been sold, even the assumed names under which the conspirators had conducted their business. The last entry was dated November 1848. The venture concludes, "Today, we've agreed to cease operations. The risks have become too great. Federal authorities are investigating smuggling along the Georgia coast. Harper believes we should destroy all records. I disagree. The documentation proves our accounting is correct and protects each partner from false claims by the others. I'll keep this journal secure. No one will find it who shouldn't." Elizabeth closed the journal as dawn began to break. She sat by the window, watching pink light spread across the fields where slaves, some of whom might have been smuggled here, might have been part of Richard's crime, were already emerging from their quarters to begin another day of forced labor. The question that terrified her most wasn't what Richard had done. It was how Thomas, a slave, had gotten his hands on this journal and why he'd chosen to give it to her. When the household began to stir, Elizabeth rang for her maid and asked that the doors be checked. Every single door in the house was locked from the inside, exactly as they'd been secured the night before. The windows were all latched. The night watchman reported nothing unusual during his rounds. The dogs in their kennel had barked briefly around midnight, but had settled quickly. There was no possible way for anyone to have entered the house. Yet Thomas had been in her bedroom, had stood at the foot of her bed, had spoken to her, placed the journal on her dresser, and walked out the front door. And now Elizabeth knew her husband was a smuggler and a criminal, and she knew that a slave had access to evidence that could hang Richard and a dozen other powerful men. She also knew with cold certainty that her life had just become very dangerous. Richard returned from Savannah 3 days later, arriving in the late afternoon with gifts for Elizabeth and their daughter Sarah, silk fabric from a merchant, expensive and lovely. He was in good spirits, talking about successful business dealings, about contracts signed and partnerships solidified. Elizabeth waited until after dinner, until Sarah had gone to bed, until the servants had retired to their quarters. Then she placed the leather journal on Richard's desk in his study. He was pouring brandy when he saw it. The decanter slipped in his hand, splashing amber liquid across the desk. He made no move to clean it up, just stared at the journal as if it were a coiled snake. "Where did you get that?" His voice was barely a whisper. "A man named Thomas brought it to me. In our bedroom in the middle of the night, while I was sleeping." Richard's face went from red to white. Thomas was in our house in our bedroom, Richard standing at the foot of our bed. He placed this on my dresser and walked out through locked doors past guards and dogs like he owned the place. Richard collapsed into his chair. "Dear God, I read it, all of it." Elizabeth's voice was steady despite the fury and fear wearing inside her. "Every single page, the ships, the people, the bribes, everything you did. Elizabeth, don't." She held up a hand. "Don't insult me with excuses or justifications. I don't and to hear about financial troubles or desperate measures. You smuggled human beings, Richard. You broke federal law. You could hang for this, I know." He buried his face in his hands. "Then explain to me how a slave has this journal, how he got into our house, and why you haven't had him killed to protect yourself." Richard looked up at her, and for the first time in their 15-year marriage, Elizabeth saw genuine fear in her husband's eyes. "I can't kill him," Richard said. "None of us can. He's a slave. You own him. You could. He has copies." The words came out flat, defeated. "Multiple copies, hidden God knows where. If anything happens to him, if he disappears, if he dies, even if he's sold away, those copies go to federal authorities, to newspapers in the north, to the British government, which has ships patrolling for smugglers and treaties allowing them to prosecute American citizens." Elizabeth sank into a chair across from him. "How many people know about this? The conspirators, maybe 15 men total. And Thomas. Who is Thomas? Why was he keeping records for you?" Richard reached for his brandy glass with shaking hands. "The operation was complex. Multiple ships, multiple buyers, dozens of transactions. We needed someone to maintain accurate books. Who owed what? Who'd received what? How profits should be divided. We couldn't trust each other to do it honestly, and we couldn't hire a white bookkeeper without risking exposure. So you used an educated slave. Thomas came over on the second voyage, 1845. He could read and write, learned in Africa before his capture. We think most unusual. Harper thought we should keep him, use him. He was intelligent, detail-oriented, perfect for the work. And it never occurred to any of you that giving an enslaved man detailed records of your crimes might backfire." Richard's laugh was bitter. "Of course it occurred to us, but we needed him, and we thought." He paused. "We thought we could control him. We thought keeping him enslaved, keeping him dependent on us would be enough, but he made copies. We didn't know until 1848, after we'd ended the operation. That's when Thomas sent each of us a message, a single page delivered to our homes. It contained exact details from the records, details only he could know, and it made clear that if anything happened to him, everything would become public." Elizabeth tried to process this. "So, for 9 years you've been held hostage by your own slave?" "Yes." "And he can come and go as he pleases?" "Not exactly. He still works the fields, still lives in the quarters, but 3 times a week he visits each of the conspirators, walks right up to the main house, comes inside, stays for 10 or 15 minutes, then leaves." "What does he do during these visits?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Nothing. He just exists there, stands in our homes, reminds us that he has power over us. It's psychological, a demonstration of control, and you all just let him. What choice do we have? If we try to stop him, we show weakness or fear, he might interpret it as a threat. If we treat him harshly, he might decide revenge is worth his own life. So we maintain this bizarre dance. He walks through our doors, we pretend it's normal, and we all live with this sword hanging over our heads." Elizabeth stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened fields. "There's something you're not telling me, something worse than what's in the journal." Richard was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, "The numbers in that journal aren't complete." "What do you mean? The official records show 643 people smuggled over 3 years, but the actual number was higher." Much higher. How much higher? I don't know. Only Thomas knows. He kept 2 sets of books, one for us to divide profits and one that recorded the truth. The real numbers, including the ones who died during transport, the ones who were sold under false names. The children separated from mothers. His voice broke. The complete accounting of everything we did. Elizabeth felt sick. And those records are what he's holding over you. Yes, because they don't just prove smuggling, they prove murder, fraud, conspiracy. They name every official we bribed, every law we broke, every lie we told. If those records become public, it won't just be hanging. It'll be the destruction of this entire county's leadership, judges, sheriffs, politicians, plantation owners, everyone who profited from what we did or looked the other way. Good, Elizabeth said coldly. You all deserve it, perhaps. Richard's voice was hollow. But consider what that means for you, Elizabeth, for Sarah. Do you want to be known as the wife of a hanged smuggler? Do you want Sarah to grow up with that shame? Elizabeth closed her eyes. She'd been so focused on the moral horror of what Richard had done that she hadn't fully considered the practical consequences for her own life. What do we do? She finally asked. We do nothing. We live with it. We wait and hope that Thomas never decides to use what he knows, and we pray that no one else discovers the truth before we're all dead and beyond punishment. That's your plan. Just wait and hope. Do you have a better one? Elizabeth didn't answer. Because she didn't. Outside in the darkness beyond the window, she thought she saw movement near the tree. A figure maybe, or just shadows playing tricks in the moonlight. But she knew somehow that Thomas was out there watching, waiting, always present, even when invisible, and she understood finally why her husband looked so haunted. Why all the wealthy men in the county moved through their days with shoulders slightly hunched, as if bearing a weight no one else could see. They were prisoners of their own crimes, and the man who held the key to their cell was someone they'd tried to treat as property. The irony would have been beautiful if it wasn't so terrifying. While the white families of the county lived in fear of what Thomas might do, Thomas himself lived in a different kind of fear, one that no amount of power over his former masters could eliminate. He worked the Patterson plantation owned by William Patterson, a man whose cruelty was legendary, even in a region known for harsh treatment of slaves. Patterson believed that discipline was the foundation of profitable agriculture, and his definition of discipline involved regular whippings, reduced rations for minor infractions, and deliberate humiliation designed to break spirits. Thomas worked those fields from dawn until dusk, his hands bleeding at the end of each day, his back aching from bending over cotton plants that seemed to stretch to the horizon. He lived in a cabin that leaked when it rained and offered little protection from winter cold. He ate the same inadequate food as every other slave on the plantation: cornmeal, occasional salt, pork, whatever vegetables they could grow in the small plots behind their quarters. In every visible way, he was no different from the hundreds of other enslaved people in the county. But 3 times a week after the sun set and other slaves were locked in their quarters for the night, Thomas would wash his face, put on the coat he kept hidden under his bed, the fine coat that Ruth had stolen from Patterson's closet years ago, and walked to the main house. He never hurried, never looked nervous. He walked as if he had every right to be there, as if the path from the quarters to the big house was his too. The overseers saw him. Everyone saw him, but no one said a word. The first time it happened, 6 months after Thomas had sent his messages to the conspirators, an overseer named Dutch had tried to stop him. "Where you think you're going, boy?" Dutch had stepped into Thomas's path, rifle raised. Thomas had stopped and looked at him calmly. "Mr. Patterson is expecting me. Like hell he is. Get back to the quarters before you what?" Thomas's voice was quiet but firm. "Before you shoot me, go ahead. Pull that trigger. See what happens next." Something in Thomas's eyes had stopped Dutch. Not fear. Thomas showed no fear at all, but certainty. The absolute confidence of a man who knew exactly how far his power extended. Dutch had lowered the rifle. "I'll need to check with Mr. Patterson." "Of course, I'll wait." Dutch had run to the house, burst into Patterson's study. "Sir, that slave Thomas is walking up to the house like he owns the place. Should I?" Patterson had gone pale. "Let him through." "But, sir, let him through." Patterson's voice had been sharp with panic. Don't touch him, don't threaten him, don't even look at him wrong. Do you understand me?" Dutch had returned, confused and frustrated, and waved Thomas past. That had been 5 years ago. Now, no one even pretended to stop him. Thomas climbed the steps of the Patterson mansion and opened the front door without knocking. He walked through the foyer, past the parlor where Patterson's wife sat with her needlework, past the dining room where Pat Urson's children were finishing their dinner. No one looked at him. No one spoke. It was as if he were invisible, or as if acknowledging his presence would somehow make the situation more real. He found William Patterson in his study as always, hunched over his desk with a whiskey glass in his hand. Thomas stood in the doorway for exactly 60 seconds, counted them silently in his head. Patterson didn't look up, but his hand shook as he lifted the glass to his lips. When 60 seconds had passed, Thomas turned and walked out the same way he'd come. The entire visit took less than 5 minutes. He spoke no words, made no threats, did nothing except exist in a space where he shouldn't be able to exist. And that was enough, because Patterson knew they all knew that Thomas could do so much more. Could deliver those copies to authorities, could stand in a courtroom and testify to everything he'd witnessed, could write letters to newspapers, to politicians, to anyone who would listen. The visits were reminders, gentle, silent reminders, that the power dynamic had shifted in ways that couldn't be changed. Thomas walked back to the quarters in the darkness. As he approached, he saw Ruth sitting on the steps of her cabin, smoking a pipe she'd made from a corn cob. Ruth was 70 if she was a day, brought to America as a child, back when the slave trade was still legal. She'd survived owners, overseers, separations from her children, and every other horror that slavery inflicted. And somehow, she'd maintained a core of humanity that nothing could break. "Evening, Thomas," she said as he passed. "Evening, Ruth. You have your walk tonight?" "I did. Patterson's still shaking like a leaf when you come in." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. "He is." Ruth took a long draw on her pipe. "You know they're going to try to kill you eventually. Fear only works so long before it turns to desperation." "I know. And you know that when they do, they'll make it look like an accident or like another slave did it. They'll be clever about it." "I know that too." "Then why you keep walking into their houses? Why not just let them live in fear without the reminder?" Thomas sat down on the steps beside her. This was the only place he felt safe enough to show vulnerability, to let the mask slip slightly, because he said quietly, "Fear fades. Memory softens. People convince themselves that threats aren't real, that consequences won't come. If I stop the visits, within a year they'll have convinced themselves I don't really have the power I claim. They'll start thinking of ways to test me. Better to remind them regularly." "That's the practical answer," Ruth said. "What's the real one?" Thomas was silent for a moment. "The real one is that those walks are the only freedom I have, the only moments where I'm not property, not controlled, not subject to their whims. When I walk through Patterson's front door for those 5 minutes, I'm not a slave. I'm a man with power, and I need those minutes to remember what that feels like." Ruth nodded slowly. "Freedom in a cage is still a cage. I know. You could run, go north, use those records to buy protection from abolitionists, and abandon everyone else here, use my knowledge only for myself while hundreds of other people remain enslaved. You don't owe them anything, Thomas. Survival isn't selfish. Maybe not. But I've spent 12 years keeping those records safe, maintaining that power. If I run, it was all for nothing. If I stay, maybe I can find a way to use what I know to do more than just protect myself. Or maybe you'll just get yourself killed and then everyone suffers." Thomas stood. "Maybe, but at least I'll have died as a man, not property." Ruth shook her head. "You're a fool, Thomas. A brave fool, but a fool nonetheless, probably." He went into his cabin, the small, drafty space that was his only private refuge, and pulled up the loose floorboard where he kept his most precious possessions, a pencil nearly worn down to a nub, paper stolen sheet by sheet from Patterson's study over the course of years, and a small journal where Thomas kept his own records, not the copies that threatened the conspirators. Those were hidden in locations even he only visited twice a year. This was different. This was personal. Thomas wrote down the date, August 17th, 1857. Then he wrote, "Mrs. Hartley received the journal. She knows now. Richard will have told her everything by now. Another family aware of the truth. Another weight added to the burden they carry. Harry." He paused, then added, "Ruth says I should run. She's probably right. But running means admitting that nothing has changed. That power still belongs only to those born white and free. I won't give them that victory. Not yet." Thomas hid the journal again, lay down on his thin mattress and stared at the ceiling. Sleep came slowly, as it always did. His mind was too full of calculations, of risks, of the delicate balance he maintained every single day. He was the most powerful slave in Georgia, and also the most vulnerable, because the moment his protection failed, the moment those records were discovered or his utility ended, he would be dead before sunset. Living with that knowledge was its own form of torture, one that no white person in the county could ever truly understand. By 1859, Thomas's situation had become so normalized that the younger generation, children who'd grown up seeing him walk through their homes, barely questioned it. Sarah Hartley was 17 that summer, caught between childhood and adulthood, between innocence and the harsh realities of the world she'd been born into. She'd known about Thomas her entire conscious life, the strange slave who came to their house regularly, who her father spoke of only in worried whispers, who seemed to move through society according to rules no one else followed. But she'd never truly paid attention until the night she saw something that changed her understanding of everything. It was late July, oppressively hot. Sarah company, oldn't sleep, so she'd gone to the kitchen for water. The house was dark, everyone supposedly asleep. She was padding through the hallway in her nightgown when she heard voices coming from her father's study. One voice was her father's, the other was unfamiliar, but somehow commanding. Sarah knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, but curiosity overwhelmed propriety. She moved silently to the study door, which stood slightly ajar, and listened. "Can't continue like this forever." Her father was saying, "You know that. I know." The other voice, Thomas's, though Sarah didn't know that yet, was calm, measured. "But forever is a long time. I'm only concerned with today. But the war that's coming might free me, might kill me, might change nothing. I can't plan for variables I can't control. Mr. Hartley, if the Union wins, if they free the slaves, you won't need your protection anymore. You could simply walk away. And if the Confederacy wins, if slavery continues for another 50 years, then my protection becomes even more valuable." Sarah heard her father sigh. "What do you want, Thomas? Really want if you could have anything?" There was a long pause. Sarah pressed closer to the door, desperate to hear the answer. "I want to live long enough to see every man who smuggled human beings held accountable for his crimes. I want to see justice, real justice, not the twisted version we pretend at in courtrooms where some people count as property. I want my daughter to grow up free." Sarah's breath caught. "Daughter." Thomas had a daughter. "You have a child?" Her father sounded shocked. "Born last month. Her mother is Lily from the Bradford plantation. Bradford doesn't know yet. And before you ask, no, I won't tell you where Lily is hiding her. I learned from your example about the importance of information security. Thomas, that child will grow up in a different world than I did, Mr. Hartley. I'll make certain of it. Whether through your laws changing or through the evidence I've kept, one way or another, she'll be free. That's what I want. I hope you get it," Richard said quietly. "I genuinely do. What we did, what I did, it haunts me every single day." "Good," Thomas said, and Sarah heard no sympathy in his voice. "It should haunt you. You should never have a moment's peace for the rest of your life." Footsteps approached the door. Sarah fled silently back to her room, her heart pounding. Thomas had a daughter. Thomas spoke to her father as an equal, no more than an equal, as a superior, and her father, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the county, accepted it. Sarah lay in bed, processing what she'd heard. The pieces of a puzzle she'd never known existed were starting to come together, and the picture they formed was disturbing. Over the following weeks, Sarah began paying closer attention. She noticed how the prominent men of the county carried themselves, the slight hunch to their shoulders, the way their eyes would dart around rooms as if looking for threats, the way spared conversations that stopped abruptly when others approached. She noticed how Thomas moved through public spaces. She saw him once in town walking past the courthouse. A group of white men stepped aside to let him pass, then watched him with expressions of mingled hatred and fear. She saw Judge Kent nearly drop his walking stick when Thomas appeared on the same street corner. She saw Franklin Bradford cross to the opposite side of the road rather than pass close to where Thomas stood. These men who wielded enormous power, who decided the fates of hundreds of enslaved people with casual indifference, were afraid of a single slave. Sarah needed to understand why. She started spending time in her father's study when he was away, carefully reading through papers and correspondence. She found nothing explicit, but she found traces, references to the Georgia matter and the coastal situation, letters from attorneys discussing statute of limitations for federal crimes, a note from Judge Kent that read simply, "We maintain our position, no changes can be made." Then one day, while searching through a trunk in the attic, ostensibly looking for old quilts, but really just exploring, Sarah found a metal lockbox hidden beneath layers of fabric. The lock was good, but Sarah had watched her father open similar locks before. She knew where he kept the keys, a small leather case in his desk drawer labeled as containing important household keys. It took her 3 tries to find the right key. When she opened the lockbox, she found a single item inside, a leather-bound journal. Sarah carried it to the window where the light was better and began to read. Sarah read for 3 hours straight, barely breathing as the full scope of her father's crimes became clear. The smuggling operation, the thousands of human beings stolen from their homes in Africa, packed into ships where hundreds died during the crossing, then sold like livestock in American markets. The conspirators who'd planned it all, the officials who'd been paid to look the other way. The false documentation, the calculated cruelty of it all. And through it all, mentioned repeatedly was Thomas, the record keeper, the one who documented everything. Thomas maintains meticulous accounts. One entry read, "His attention to detail is extraordinary. He records not just numbers but names, ages, family groups. Harper worries this is too much information. But I believe thoroughness protects us. If questions arise, we can prove exactly what happened." Another entry. "Thomas asked today if his work would earn his freedom." Harper laughed at him. "I did not." There was something in Thomas's eyes, intelligence, calculation. "I worry we've made a mistake in teaching him so much about our operation." And later the venture concludes today. Thomas handed over the final accounting. Harper wanted to kill him immediately, eliminate the witness. I argued against it. Thomas is too valuable, knows too much. Better to keep him close company. Untold. Patterson agreed. We voted to maintain his enslavement, but with certain allowances. The journal ended there, but Sarah understood now. They tried to control Thomas by keeping him enslaved, but Thomas had turned the tables by keeping copies of the records. Now the conspirators were the ones being controlled, trapped by their own crimes. It was brilliant, terrifying, but brilliant. Sarah carefully returned the journal to the lockbox, locked it, and replaced it exactly as she'd found it. Then she sat in the dusty attic, knees pulled to her chest, trying to process what she'd learned. Her father was a criminal, not just a slave owner, which was legal, even if Sarah had growing doubts about its morality, but an actual criminal who'd violated federal law in ways that carried the death penalty. And Thomas, the man she'd seen walking silently through their house since childhood, was the only thing standing between her father and a noose. How was she supposed to live with this knowledge? That evening at dinner, Sarah watched her father with new eyes. He looked older than she'd realized, the lines around his eyes deeper, his hands less steady. Her mother picked at her food, barely eating. The conversation was stilted, uncomfortable. They all knew her whole family was living with this terrible secret, pretending everything was normal. "Papa," Sarah said suddenly, "do you ever regret your business decisions? The ventures you invested in years ago, the silence that fell over." The table was absolute. Her father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Her mother went pale. "What brought this on?" Richard finally asked. "I've been thinking about my future, about the kind of man I might marry. I'd want someone honorable, someone who made ethical choices even when they were difficult, someone who could sleep peacefully at night." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading outward. "We all make choices," Richard said carefully. "Sometimes circumstances force decisions we'd rather not make. The world isn't as simple as the novels you read, Sarah. I know it's not simple, but surely there's a difference between difficult choices and wrong choices." "Sarah," her mother intervened, "this isn't appropriate dinner conversation, isn't it? We live in a county where people own other people, where we benefit from the labor of enslaved human beings. Shouldn't we talk about the morality of that?" "You're too young to understand the complexities. I'm 17, old enough to understand right from wrong." Richard set down his fork. "What exactly are you asking, Sarah?" She met his eyes. "I'm asking if you sleep peacefully at night, Papa. I'm asking if there are things in your past that haunt you. I'm asking if you believe in accountability for sins." Her father stared at her for a long moment, then quietly, "No, I don't sleep peacefully. And yes, I believe in accountability. I live with it every single day." Sarah nodded. "Good. You should." She excused herself from the table, leaving her parents in stunned silence. That night, lying in bed, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't undo her father's crimes. She couldn't free the slaves who'd been smuggled. She couldn't reverse time and prevent any of it. But she could choose not to be complicit in the silence. She could choose to acknowledge the truth, even if only to herself, and someday, if the opportunity arose, she could choose to stand on the side of justice rather than comfort. It wasn't much, but it was something. If you're finding this story as gripping as we intended, we'd deeply appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel. Stories like this require extensive research into primary sources, plantation records, and historical documents. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these forgotten and disturbing chapters of American history to light. We read every comment, so share your thoughts about Thomas's impossible situation below. The conspiracy that had created Thomas's power extended far beyond the handful of plantation owners who directly participated in the smuggling. By 1860, dozens of additional people had become entangled in the web of secrets and lies. Sheriff Coleman knew he'd been one of the officials who'd accepted bribes to look the other way when slave ships arrived at hidden inlets. He'd falsified reports, intimidated potential witnesses, and used his position to protect the conspirators. Dr. Samuel Pritchard knew. He'd examined newly arrived Africans treating disease acquired during the crossing and certifying them as born in America for sale documents. His medical reputation lent credibility to the false documentation. Mayor Harrison knew he'd used his political connections to prevent federal investigators from looking too closely at Georgia's coastal activities. Even Reverend Matthews, the respected minister who preached every Sunday about Christian morality, knew something. He'd accepted donations to his church from the conspirators, donations large enough that he must have questioned their source. And they all lived in fear, not just of legal consequences, but of social destruction, because in their society, reputation was everything. A man could survive financial ruin and rebuild, but a man whose reputation was destroyed, who was publicly revealed as a criminal, a smuggler, a person who'd violated both law and decency, that man was finished. His family would be shunned. His children would never find respectable marriages. His name would become a curse. Thomas's power wasn't just that he could send men to the gallows, it was that he could destroy families, legacies, the social fabric of an entire county. One afternoon in June 1860, several of the conspirators gathered secretly at the Bradford estate to discuss their situation. The meeting had been arranged carefully, servants dismissed, guests arriving separately to avoid suspicion, doors locked and windows covered. Franklin Bradford poured whiskey for the assembled group. Richard, Hartley, William Patterson, Judge Kent, Sheriff Coleman, Dr. Pritchard, and 3 other plantation owners who'd invested in the smuggling operation. "Gentlemen," Bradford began, We've lived under Thomas's thumb for 12 years. I think it's time we seriously discussed our options. We've had this conversation a dozen times." Judge Kent said wearily. "We haven't found a solution yet because we've been too cautious, too afraid to take decisive action." "Decisive action?" Patterson's voice was sharp. "You mean murder? Say it plainly, Franklin." "Fine. Yes, I mean eliminating the threat." "And the copies of the records?" Richard asked. "The ones that will be delivered to authorities if anything happens to Thomas." "We don't know for certain those copies exist," Bradford argued. "Maybe it's a bluff. Maybe there's only the one set and Thomas has simply convinced us it's not a bluff." Dr. Pritchard spoke up for the first time. 3 years ago, my son, drunk and foolish, tried to attack Thomas, wanted to teach the upidity and grow a lesson. Before the boy could land a blow, Thomas stopped him with a single sentence. "Your father examined 73 children under the age of 5, certified them as born in Virginia, and sold them to markets in New Orleans. That information is currently held by 3 different people who don't know each other. If I don't meet with each of them by specific dates, they have instructions to deliver sealed packages to federal authorities." The room was silent. My son was so terrified by the specificity, by the fact that Thomas knew the exact numbers that he ran. He left Georgia entirely, moved to Texas. And Thomas was right. I did examine 73 children. That number isn't in any documents we kept. It's in the records that only Thomas maintained. "So the copies are real," Sheriff Coleman said heavily. "Which means we're trapped. Perhaps not permanently," Judge Kent said thoughtfully. "Gentlemen, consider Thomas is what, 35 years old? 36. He could live another 30 years, maybe 40, but we won't. Most of us are already in our 52nds or 62nds. Patterson, you're nearly 70. Your point?" "My point is that time solves this problem for us. Eventually, Thomas will die, and when he does, whatever instructions he's left will be executed by people who have no personal stake in the matter, people who can be bribed, intimidated, or reasoned with." "More," Richard said quietly. "When Thomas dies, those instructions will be carried out exactly as he planned. Evidence delivered, crimes exposed. Our children and grandchildren left to bear the shame. Better them than us," Bradford muttered. Richard stood abruptly. "Listen to yourselves. You're planning for Thomas's natural death while hoping your own comes first, so you can die before facing consequences. That's not a strategy, that's cowardice." "Then what do you suggest?" Patterson demanded. "Confession. Should we all march to federal court and admit everything? Hang honorably? Of course not. But we could stop making it worse. Stop treating Thomas as an enemy to be defeated. Except that we created this situation through our own greed and criminality." "Easy for you to say." Bradford shot back. "Your fortune was already substantial before the venture. The rest of us needed that money to survive. No one needs money badly enough to justify smuggling human beings. Don't lecture us on morality now, Richard. You were part of it. You voted for it. You profited from it just like the rest of us." Richard's shoulders slumped. "I know, God help me, I know." The meeting dissolved shortly after with no solution reached and no plan agreed upon. The conspirators returned to their homes, each one carrying the same burden they'd carried for years. Thomas's power held because it was rooted in truth, and truth, once established, couldn't be undone by conspiracy or violence. It could only be carried like chains that grew heavier with every passing year. While the white families obsessed over Thomas's power, Thomas himself worried about something far more important, his family. Lily worked the Bradford Plantation, 3 miles from Patterson's land where Thomas lived. She was 22 years old, strong from years of field work, and she'd caught Thomas's eye 2 years earlier when their paths crossed at a rare gathering of slaves from multiple plantations. Their relationship had developed slowly, carefully. Slaves weren't allowed to marry across plantations. It complicated ownership and created divided loyalties. But love didn't respect the laws of property, and Thomas and Lily had found ways to see each other. Thomas would use his evening freedom to walk to the Bradford plantation. Franklin Bradford, terrified of Thomas, as all the conspirators were, never dared question these visits. Thomas would spend an hour with Lily in the quarters, speaking quietly, planning for a future that seemed impossibly distant. When Lily became pregnant, they both knew it complicated everything. A child of Thomas's would be born into slavery, owned by Bradford, but that child would also be the daughter of the only slave in Georgia who held power over white men. The target on that child's back would be enormous. "We need to get her out," Lily had whispered one night, her hand on her swollen belly. "When she's born, we need to get her away from here." "Where?" "How?" Thomas asked. "I can't leave. If I disappear, everything I've built collapses. They'll destroy the evidence, kill anyone who knows anything, and make sure no trace remains. Then I'll take her. I'll run. They'll hunt you. Bradford will send trackers, dogs. They'll claim you stole valuable property, both yourself and the child. Then what do we do? Let her grow up enslaved? Let Bradford sell her away when she's old enough to work?" Thomas had no answer. He was powerful in specific ways, but he couldn't protect his own family. The irony was bitter. The baby was born in August 1859, a girl they named Grace, though they couldn't officially register the name anywhere. For the first months of her life, Grace lived with Lily in the Bradford slave quarters, and Thomas visited when he could. Franklin Bradford knew about the child. Everyone knew, but Bradford had made a calculated decision not to interfere. Thomas's visits to his plantation were already unsettling enough. Antagonizing the man by threatening his daughter seemed like begging for disaster. So an unspoken agreement existed. Bradford pretended not to notice Thomas's family. Thomas maintained his usual schedule of visits to Bradford's home. Neither acknowledged the deeper implications, but Thomas knew this arrangement couldn't last forever. When Grace was 6 months old, Thomas made a decision. He approached Bradford directly during one of his regular visits. "I want to buy my daughter's freedom," Thomas said. Bradford, who'd been staring fixedly at his desk as always during Thomas's visits, looked up in genuine surprise. "You want what?" "I'll pay you for her. For Grace. Name a price. Slaves can't own property. You can't buy anything. Then I'll provide you with information that's worth far more than one infant's market value. Information about your fellow conspirators, things they've done that you don't know about, things that would shift the balance of power among you." Bradford's eyes narrowed. "You'd betray the others to save your daughter. Without hesitation, but I'd prefer a simpler transaction. You set a price. I find a way to pay it through intermediaries. Grace becomes free. And if I refuse," Thomas leaned forward sly, "then I'll remember that you had the chance to do one good thing, one small act of decency, and chose cruelty instead. I'll remember that when I decide what to do with the records I hold." It was the closest Thomas had ever come to an explicit threat. The balance of their strange relationship shifted in that moment. Bradford was silent for a long time. "If I free the child, she has nowhere to go. Lily isn't free. You aren't free. Grace would be free on paper, but functionally still enslaved. She'd have options you and I don't. She could be sent north, could be placed with free black families who'd raise her, or she could be kidnapped and re-enslaved. It happens all the time, Thomas. You know that." Thomas did know that free papers meant nothing if someone decided to ignore them and claim you were escaped property. "I'm offering you the chance to be less of a monster than you already are," Thomas said finally. "Take it or don't, but know that your choice will be remembered." Bradford stood and walked to his safe. He pulled out a blank manumission form, the legal document that granted freedom to enslaved individuals. His hand shook slightly as he filled in Grace's name, her approximate birth date, her status. "No payment," Bradford said. "I'll free her without cost, not because I'm merciful, but because I'm tired. I'm so goddamn tired of living like this, of fearing a man I'm supposed to own, of jumping at shadows. If freeing one child buys me an ounce of peace, so be it." He signed the document and handed it to Thomas. "This makes her legally free. It doesn't make her safe. You understand the difference?" "I do. Then take it and get out of my house." Thomas took the papers carefully, folded them and placed them inside his coat. He walked to the door, then paused. "Thank you," he said quietly. Bradford laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "Don't thank me. I did it out of weakness, not virtue, and we both know it." Thomas left the Bradford estate that night carrying the most valuable thing he'd ever possessed, proof that his daughter was not property. It wasn't safety. Bradford was right about that. But it was a chance. And in a world where enslaved people had no chances, one chance was everything. After discovering the truth about her father, Sarah Hartley's understanding of her world cracked and reformed like ice-breaking in spring thaw. She'd been raised to believe in a natural order, white people superior, black people inferior, slavery not ideal perhaps, but necessary, justified, biblically supported, the plantation owners as benevolent stewards of people too primitive to care for themselves. Every sermon she'd heard, every lesson from her governesses, every conversation among adults in her life had reinforced this narrative. But the journal showed her something different. It showed white men, the most respected men in her community, committing crimes so heinous that even their own legal system would execute them for it. It showed those same men afraid of a sigh, illegally enslaved person, because that person had intelligence, discipline, and integrity they lacked. Thomas wasn't inferior, Thomas was extraordinary, and the men who claimed superiority were actually moral cowards. Once Sarah saw this truth, she couldn't unsee it. She started noticing things, the way slaves were spoken of in her presence, as if they couldn't understand or had no feelings, the casual cruelty she'd witnessed her entire life but never questioned, the elaborate justifications her community constructed to explain why owning human beings was acceptable. It was all lies, comfortable lies, that allowed people like her family to live in luxury built on suffering. Sarah began spending time in the kitchen, speaking with the house slaves, actually speaking to them, asking about their lives, listening to their answers. She learned names she'd never bothered to learn before, heard stories of families separated, children sold, hopes destroyed. Her mother noticed the change. "Sarah, it's inappropriate to become too familiar with the servants. They have their place. We have ours. Their place." Sarah's voice was sharper than she intended. "They're people, Mother. They have thoughts, feelings, families, just like us. Of course they do, dear. No one denies that. But the social order must be maintained. If we become too familiar, they might forget their station, or we might remember our humanity." Elizabeth stared at her daughter. "You sound like an abolitionist. Would that be so terrible? In this county?" "Yes, it would be dangerous, Sarah, for you and for this family." Sarah wanted to shout that the family deserved whatever danger came to it, that her father's crimes warranted punishment, that his fear was justice, but she held her tongue. Destroying her family wouldn't help the slaves who'd already been smuggled, wouldn't undo the crimes. So instead, she started educating herself. She read everything she could find about abolition, about the arguments for and against slavery, about the growing tensions between North and South. She had to hide her reading material, books by Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe, other abolitionist writers, because possession of such literature was effectively illegal in Georgia. And she started paying very close attention to Thomas. She watched him move through their house during his visits, seeing him properly for the first time. He wasn't shuffling or servile. He carried himself with dignity, with quiet strength. His eyes were intelligent, alert, missing nothing. One evening, Sarah did something incredibly foolish. She went to the library during one of Thomas's scheduled visits and waited for him. When Thomas entered the room, he usually spent a minute in the library during each visit. She'd learned. He stopped short at seeing her. "Miss Hartley," he said quietly, "you shouldn't be here. It's my home. Why shouldn't I be in the library? You know why?" Sarah stood. "I read my father's journal, the one from the lockbox in the attic. See, I know what you're doing, why they're afraid of you." Thomas's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Then you know this conversation is dangerous for both of us." "I know. I don't care." She took a breath. "I want to help." "Help? How?" "I don't know yet. But what my father did, what all of them did, it was evil. They should be held accountable. If your records can do that, I want to help make sure they're not destroyed." Thomas studied her for a long moment. "How old are you?" 17. Young enough to still believe in simple justice. Old enough to be dangerous if you act without thinking. He moved toward the door. "Miss Hartley, the best way you can help is to stay silent, stay safe, and wait. When the time comes, and it will come, People with conscience will be needed to rebuild. Be one of those people. That's not enough. I want to do something now. Wanting to do something and knowing what to do are very different. You can't undo your father's crimes by exposing him. That would destroy your mother, ruin your own future, and accomplish nothing for the people who were smuggled. They're scattered across 5 states now, sold and resold. Justice for them is impossible. Then what's the point of the records you keep? Thomas paused at the door. Insurance, protection, and maybe someday testimony, but not revenge. Never revenge. Revenge is poison. He looked back at her. You want to help? Then when this war comes, and it's coming, Miss Hartley, anyone can see that. Choose the right side. Use whatever privilege you have to help people who have none. That's how you make amends for benefits you've received from evil. He left before she could respond. Sarah stood in the library, shaking slightly. She'd expected to feel heroic, brave. Instead, she felt small, naive, reminded that her desire to help was rooted partly in wanting to absolve her own guilt. But Thomas was right about one thing. A war was coming. Everyone could feel it. The tensions between North and South were reaching breaking points. Violence in Kansas, political crisis in Congress, debates about slavery becoming louder, more bitter. And when that war came, Sarah would have choices to make. She just hoped she'd have the courage to make the right ones. Not everyone connected to the conspiracy was content to live in fear. Some men, particularly those with less to lose, began plotting active solutions. Carl Vicksburg was one of the overseers on the Patterson plantation, a hard man who'd made his living through violence and intimidation. He'd been hired after the smuggling operation ended, so he knew nothing about the specific crimes, but he knew about Thomas's unusual privileges, and it enraged him. It ain't natural, he complained to the other overseers over whiskey, that Negro walking around like he owns the place, coming and going as he pleases. Something needs to be done. Patterson allows it. Another overseer pointed out, we can't go against what the boss wants. Patterson's gone soft. Or Thomas has something on him. Either way, it's wrong. Slaves need to remember their place or everything falls apart. Vicksburg started watching Thomas carefully, looking for opportunities. He knew he couldn't just kill the man, too obvious, too likely to cause problems, but maybe he could arrange an accident or provoke Thomas into doing something that would justify punishment. One night, Vicksburg was on patrol when he saw Thomas leaving the Patterson house after one of his regular visits. On impulse, Vicksburg stepped into Thomas's path. "Boy," Vicksburg said, hand on his whip. "You got a pass to be out here?" Thomas stopped and looked at him calmly. "Mr. Patterson knows where I am. That ain't what I asked. I asked if you got a pass, written permission. I don't need a pass for where I've been. Every slave needs a pass to leave the quarters at night. That's the rule. And since you don't have one, I'm well within my rights to discipline you." Vicksburg raised his whip. He was smiling, anticipating the satisfaction of bringing this uppity slave down. Thomas didn't flinch, didn't back away, just looked at Vicksburg with those intelligent, measuring eyes. "Mr. Vicksburg," Thomas said quietly, "before you do what you're thinking of doing, I want you to consider something. You've been working here for 3 years. In that time you've noticed that I have unusual privileges. You've wondered why. You've been told not to question it. So what? So ask yourself, what could a slave possibly have that would make men like William Patterson, who eats men like you for breakfast, afraid? What would make him tolerate behavior he'd normally punish with death?" Vicksburg's smile faltered slightly. "The answer," Thomas continued, "is information. I have information that can destroy every powerful man in this county. That information is protected. If I die, if I'm injured, if I disappear, it becomes public and everyone connected to it suffers. I got nothing to do with whatever dirt you're holding. No, but Patterson does. And if Patterson suffers because you couldn't control yourself, what do you think he'll do to you?" Vicksburg lowered the whip slowly. "You're bluffing, am I? Then hit me, see what happens tomorrow. See if Patterson keeps you employed. See if you don't find yourself run out of Georgia entirely." The two men stood facing each other in the darkness. Finally, Vicksburg stepped aside. Thomas walked past without another word, but Vicksburg's rage didn't dissipate. It festered. He started drinking more, complaining more, talking about how something needed to be done about Thomas. One of the other overseers, worried about where this was heading, finally went to Patterson with concerns. Patterson called Vicksburg into his office the next day. "I hear you've been making threats about Thomas," Patterson said coldly. "Not threats, sir. Just saying what everyone's thinking, that it ain't right how you will leave Thomas alone. Completely alone. You will not speak to him, look at him, or acknowledge his existence. If you can't do that, you're welcome to seek employment elsewhere." Vicksburg stared. "Sir, I don't understand. He's not just anything. He's untouchable. And if you can't accept that, you're of no use to me. But why? What's he got that?" Patterson stood up, his face red. "Because he has the power to destroy me, you idiot. He has evidence of crimes that would see me hanged, and he's made arrangements so that evidence becomes public if anything happens to him. So yes, he walks around freely. Yes, he has privileges. And yes, we all tolerate it, because the alternative is our death. Does that answer your question?" Vicksburg's face had gone pale. "What kind of crimes? The kind you never speak of. Not to me, not to anyone. The kind that are buried and need to stay buried." Patterson sat back down heavily. "You have a choice, Vicksburg. Accept the situation and continue working here with generous pay, or leave today and never return. Choose now." Vicksburg chose to stay. But the conversation planted seeds. He started asking quiet questions, speaking to other overseers at other plantations, piecing together whispers and rumors. Within 6 months, he had a rough outline of what the conspiracy had been: smuggling, illegal importation, probably from Africa, and he began to wonder if there was profit to be made from this information. If Thomas's records were valuable enough to protect him, maybe they'd be valuable to others too. To federal authorities, maybe, or to newspapers, or even to the conspirators themselves. Might they pay to have the records destroyed? Vicksburg didn't act on these thoughts immediately, but they simmered in his mind, a backup plan if things ever got bad enough that he needed money quickly. He wasn't the only person making such calculations. Throughout the county, others who'd learned fragments of the truth were considering how that knowledge might be leveraged. Thomas's power was holding for now, but it rested on a foundation of fear, and fear could only last so long before it transformed into something more dangerous: desperation. Stories like this exist in the gray spaces of American history, where documented fact meets oral tradition and uncomfortable truths. If you're finding value in this deep dive into a darker chapter of our past, please consider liking this video. It helps others discover these forgotten stories and encourages us to continue researching the shadows that history often glosses over. Your engagement makes this work possible. The secession of South Carolina in December 1860 sent shockwaves through Georgia. By January 1861, Georgia had followed, and by April, Fort Sumter had been fired upon. America was at war with itself. For the conspirators who'd lived under Thomas's threat for 13 years, the war represented a terrifying new variable. Subscribe my channel for more videos and next part.